Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's story, I think it would be interesting if you could tell me in the comments which city in the world you're watching this video from. Leave your comments so we can see how far this story has reached. Click the like button and subscribe. All of this because Dr. Sophie Lang's boots crunched on gravel as she stepped out of her weathered Jeep at Yellowstone National Park's research station. The crisp mountain air filled her lungs, a stark contrast to her stuffy university lab. "Dr. Lang, welcome to Yellowstone," called out Head Ranger Mike Townsend, striding over with an outstretched hand. "Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here," Sophie replied, shaking his hand firmly. Inside the station, they hunched over a map. Mike's finger traced a route through the backcountry. "We've had increased bear activity here," he said, tapping a densely forested area. "3 grizzly sightings this week alone." Sophie nodded, her excitement tinged with caution. "Any aggressive behavior?" "Nothing out of the ordinary, but stay alert. You're entering their territory." After the briefing, Sophie meticulously checked her gear. Radio, GPS, bear spray, emergency beacon, all accounted for. She hesitated over her tranquilizer gun, then secured it to her pack. Better safe than sorry. As dawn broke, Sophie set out on the trail, her pack heavy with equipment. The forest enveloped her, sunlight filtering through the canopy. Hours passed as she hiked deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization fading away. By late afternoon, Sophie reached a small clearing, perfect for her research camp. She efficiently set up her tent, secured her food in a bear-proof container, and arranged her equipment. As dusk approached, Sophie activated her radio. "Ace, this is Dr. Lang. Camp established at coordinates 44.6 degrees north, 110.5 degrees west. All clear." Static crackled before Mike's voice came through. "Copy that, Dr. Lang. Remember, check in every 12 hours. Stay safe out there." Sophie gazed at the darkening sky, a mix of anticipation and unease settling in her stomach. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. She ducked into her tent, zipping it securely. The forest's nighttime symphony began, rustling leaves, hooting owls, and the distant howl of a wolf. Sophie's mind raced with possibilities. What would her research reveal about bear behavior in this area? How close would she get to these magnificent, yet dangerous creatures? Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by every snapping twig and rustling bush. In her dreams, shadows moved at the edge of her vision, always just out of sight. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong. Sophie emerged from her tent, stretching away the night's tension. She prepared her tracking equipment, double-checking each device. As she shouldered her day pack, a twig snapped in the nearby brush. Sophie froze, her hand instinctively moving to her bear spray. Seconds ticked by. Nothing emerged. She exhaled slowly, forcing her racing heart to calm. "Get it together, Sophie," she muttered. "You're a scientist, not some scared rookie." With a deep breath, she set off into the forest. Her steps were cautious but purposeful, eyes scanning for signs of bear activity. Every overturned rock, every scratched tree trunk could hold valuable data. Hours passed as Sophie meticulously documented her findings. Scat samples were carefully collected and labeled. Claw marks on trees were photographed and measured. She felt a growing excitement as the evidence mounted. The bears were active in this area, more so than previous years' data suggested. As the sun climbed higher, Sophie paused to radio in. "Base, Dr. Lang checking in. Multiple signs of recent bear activity. Proceeding with caution." Mike's response came through clearly. "Copy, Dr. Lang. Weather report shows a storm system moving in tomorrow. Be prepared to evacuate if necessary." Sophie acknowledged the warning, her mind already racing with contingency plans. She couldn't afford to lose this opportunity, but safety had to come first. Pushing deeper into the forest, Sophie's senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The weight of her solitude pressed in on her. Suddenly, she froze. There, in a patch of mud, was an unmistakable print. A massive grizzly paw. Fresh. Sophie's heart pounded as she knelt to examine it, her scientific curiosity warring with primal fear. As she photographed the print, a low growl rumbled through the trees. Sophie's blood ran cold. Slowly, she raised her head. 50 yards away, partially hidden by foliage, stood an enormous grizzly bear. His dark eyes were fixed directly on her. Sophie's mind raced through her training. Don't run. Stay calm. Make yourself big. Slowly back away. She rose to her full height, arms raised. "Che bear," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm just passing through. No threat here." The bear huffed, taking a step forward. Sophie's hand inched toward her bear spray, her other fumbling for her radio. "Base," she whispered urgently. "This is Dr. Lang. I have a grisly encounter in progress. Stand by for..." Her words cut off as the radio emitted a burst of static, then went silent. Sophie's eyes widened in horror as she realized her lifeline had just failed. The bear, startled by the noise, rose to its hind legs with a roar that shook Sophie to her core. In that moment, facing the raw power of nature, Dr. Sophie Lang realized her routine expedition had just become a fight for survival. Sophie woke at dawn, her mind replaying yesterday's bear print discovery. She radioed base. Dr. Lang checking in, heading out to investigate recent bear activity. Copy, Dr. Lang. Stay alert, Mike replied. Sophie hiked deeper into the forest, documenting signs of bears. By midday, she'd collected several scat samples and photographed numerous claw marks on trees. "This area's teeming with bear activity," she muttered, examining a half-eaten fish carcass. Suddenly, her radio crackled. "Dr. Lang, come in." Mike's voice was garbled with static. "There's some here. Signals weak. Storm approaching. Return." The radio went silent. Sophie frowned, tapping it. No response. "Great," she sighed. An eerie silence settled over the forest. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves. Sophie's unease grew. She decided to head back to camp. As she turned, a flash of brown caught her eye. Sophie froze, heart racing. 50 yards away, partially hidden by foliage, stood a massive grizzly. "Tay bear," she called softly, slowly backing away. The bear huffed, then disappeared into the brush. Sophie exhaled shakily, adrenaline coursing through her. She hurried back to camp, constantly looking over her shoulder. At her tent, she tried the radio again. Nothing but static. "Come on, work," she pleaded, adjusting dials. No luck. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Sophie looked up at darkening skies. She needed to secure her camp and equipment before the storm hit. As she worked, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. Every snapping twig made her jump. Night fell quickly, the storm drawing closer. In her tent, Sophie reviewed her data by lantern light, trying to distract herself from the growing unease. A loud snap outside made her freeze. Something large was moving around her camp. Sophie's hand inched towards her bear spray. "It's probably just a deer," she whispered, unconvinced. The footsteps grew closer. Sophie's breath caught as a shadow fell across her tent. Then silence. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the shadow moved away. Sophie released a shaky breath. Sleep eluded her that night. Every sound, every gust of wind had her on edge. When dawn finally broke, Sophie emerged from her tent, exhausted and jumpy. The storm had passed, but Sophie's radio remained dead. She was cut off from base, alone in bear country, with the unsettling certainty that she was being hunted. Dr. Sophie Lang woke to a gray dawn, her GPS device blinking ominously. She tapped it, frowning. No signal? That can't be right. She stepped out, scanning the misty forest. The air felt heavy, foreboding. Sophie attempted to calibrate the GPS, muttering, "Come on, work." After an hour of fruitless troubleshooting, she slumped against a tree. "Great. No radio, no GPS. I'm flying blind out here." Thunder rumbles. Sophie weighed her options. Abort the mission or press on. Her scientific curiosity won out. "I can navigate old school. This data is too valuable to abandon." She packed up, double-checking her compass and maps. As she shouldered her backpack, a twig snapped nearby. Sophie froze, listening intently. Silence, then a rustle in the undergrowth. "Che bear!" she called out, heart racing. No response. Sophie set off, hyper-aware of her surroundings. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. Hours passed as she collected samples and recorded observations, constantly looking over her shoulder. By mid-afternoon, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Sophie paused, the hairs on her neck rising. A low growl echoed through the trees. "Oh God!" she whispered, slowly turning. 50 yards away stood the grizzly, its dark eyes fixed on her. Sophie's hand inched towards her bear spray. "Easy, big guy," she said softly, backing away. The bear huffed, taking a step forward. Sophie's heart pounded. She knew running was futile. Instead, she stood her ground, making herself appear larger. "Hey bear, go away," she shouted, waving her arms. The grizzly rose on its hind legs, towering over her. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, time stood still. Then, miraculously, the bear dropped back down and lumbered off into the brush. Sophie exhaled shakily, legs trembling. She needed to get back to camp, fast. As she hurried through the darkening forest, one thought consumed her. Without working equipment, she was utterly alone in this wilderness. The weight of her isolation pressed down, each step carrying her deeper into uncertainty and danger. Sophie trudged back to camp, exhausted. As she rounded a bend, she froze. The grizzly stood 20 feet away, watching her. "Easy, big guy," she whispered, slowly backing up. The bear huffed, rising on its hind legs. Sophie's hand inched towards her bear spray. "K-bear, go away," she shouted, waving her arms. The grizzly dropped to all fours, taking a step forward. Sophie's heart raced. "No, back off," she yelled, voice cracking. The bear charged. Sophie fumbled for her spray, but it was too late. 800 pounds of muscle and fur slammed into her. Pain exploded through Sophie's body as claws tore into her flesh. She screamed, struggling to protect her face and neck. "Help!" she cried, knowing no one could hear. The bear's hot breath washed over her as its jaws snapped inches from her face. Sophie fought desperately, kicking and punching. Suddenly, her hand found a rock. She swung with all her might, connecting with the bear's snout. The grizzly reared back, momentarily stunned. Sophie scrambled away, her body screaming in agony. She stumbled through the forest, vision blurring from pain and tears. Behind her, she heard the bear's roar. Sophie collapsed against a tree, gasping. Blood soaked her torn clothes. She fumbled for her emergency beacon, praying it would work. As darkness fell, Sophie huddled in the hollow of a fallen log, clutching her bear spray. Every sound made her flinch. "Trees," she whispered. "Someone find me." Sophie huddled in the fallen log, shivering. Dawn broke. She crawled out, wincing. The bear's roar echoed. Sophie froze, charged from the brush. She fumbled for her spray, but too late. The bear slammed into her, Claws tore flesh. Jaws snapped near her face. Sophie screamed, struggling. "Help!" she cried, knowing it was futile. She fought desperately, kicking, punching. Her hand found a branch. She swung, hitting the bear's eye. It reared back, roaring. Sophie scrambled away, stumbling through the forest. Pain consumed her. Blood soaked her clothes. She collapsed, gasping. The bear's growl grew closer. Sophie tensed, preparing for the worst. She played dead, lying motionless. The bear sniffed, huffed. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, it lumbered away. Sophie lay still, afraid to move. Eventually, she stirred, assessing her injuries. Deep gashes covered her body. Her leg looked broken. She needed help, fast. She crawled towards her camp, leaving a trail of blood. Each movement was agony. "Stay alive," she muttered. "Just stay alive." Night fell. Sophie reached her tent, collapsing inside. She bandaged herself with trembling hands. Outside, a twig snapped. The bear had returned. Sophie clutched her spray, heart pounding. "Please," she whispered. "Just go away." The night stretched on, a battle for survival with every breath. The first rays of dawn filtered through the torn fabric of Sophie's tent. She stirred, every movement sending waves of agony through her battered body. The events of the previous day crashed over her like a tidal wave of terror. "I'm alive," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Somehow I'm still alive." Sophie took stock of her injuries. Deep gashes crisscrossed her arms and torso, crusted with dried blood. Her left leg was swollen and discolored, likely broken. She touched her face gingerly, feeling the sting of claw marks across her cheek. "Okay, Sophie," she muttered to herself. "First things first. Gotta clean these wounds." With excruciating effort, she dragged herself to her medical kit. Using water from her canteen and antiseptic wipes, she cleaned her wounds as best she could, biting back screams of pain. As she worked, her mind raced. The radio. "I have to try the radio again." Sophie crawled to where her equipment lay scattered. She found the radio, its casing cracked from the bear's attack. With trembling hands, she turned it on. "Base, this is Dr. Lang. Do you copy? I've been attacked by a grizzly. I need immediate evacuation." Static was her only reply. "Please, anyone? I need help." Minutes passed with no response. Sophie slumped back, fighting tears of frustration and fear. Think, Sophie. What next? She knew she couldn't stay here. The bear might return, and she was a sitting duck in her ruined tent. When the radio dead, her only hope was to try and reach a ranger station or find other hikers. Sophie gathered what supplies she could into a small pack water, first aid kit, emergency rations, and her bear spray. She fashioned a crude splint for her leg using tent poles and torn fabric. As she prepared to leave, a low growl froze her in place. The bear was back. "No, no, no," Sophie whispered, her heart pounding. She peered out of the tent, seeing the massive grizzly sniffing around her campsite, just 30 feet away. Sophie weighed her options. She couldn't outrun the bear, not in her condition. Fighting was out of the question. Her only choice was to try and scare it off or hide. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sophie grabbed her bear spray and unzipped the tent. "Hey, bear!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Get out of here!" The bear's head snapped towards her, eyes gleaming with predatory focus. It rose on its hind legs, towering over her. Sophie raised the bear spray, praying it would work. As the bear dropped to all fours and began to charge, Sophie unleashed a stream of pepper spray directly at its face. The effect was immediate. The bear reared back, roaring in pain and confusion. It pawed at its eyes, stumbling away from the campsite. Sophie didn't waste a second. Ignoring the screaming pain in her leg, she hobbled as fast as she could in the opposite direction. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to put as much distance between herself and the bear as possible. Hours passed in a haze of pain and fear. Sophie pushed herself beyond her limits, using trees for support as she limped through the forest. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide another predator. As the sun began to set, Sophie's strength finally gave out. She collapsed at the base of a large tree, gasping for breath. Her wounds had reopened, fresh blood staining her makeshift bandages. "Help!" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Somebody, please help me." In the gathering darkness, Sophie heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable huffing of a bear. It had followed her trail of blood. With the last of her strength, Sophie pulled herself up into the lower branches of the tree. She climbed as high as she could, fighting back screams of pain. On her perch, she watched in terror as the grizzly emerged from the underbrush. His fur was matted with blood, her blood. It sniffed the ground where she had fallen, then looked up at her in the tree. Sophie clung to the branches, her entire body shaking. The bear circled the tree, occasionally standing up to sweat at the lower branches. She was out of its reach, but for how long? As night fell, Sophie found herself in a desperate stalemate. She was safe for the moment, but trapped. The bear showed no signs of leaving, content to wait her out. "Stay awake," Sophie told herself, fighting against exhaustion and blood loss. "You have to stay awake." But as the hours crawled by, Sophie felt her grip on consciousness slipping. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the bear, still circling below, patient and relentless. In her feverish dreams, Sophie heard the distant whump-whump of helicopter blades. But was it real, or just another cruel trick of her dying mind? At Yellowstone's ranger station, Mike Townsend paced anxiously. "It's been 36 hours since Drive Lang's last check-in," he announced to the assembled team. "Something's wrong." Deputy Ranger Sarah Chen frowned. "Could be equipment failure. The storm might have knocked out her radio." Mike shook his head. "Sophie's too experienced to miss 2 check-ins. We need to mobilize a search party." Within the hour, a team of 6 rangers was gearing up. Mike briefed them, pointing to a map. "Dr. Lang's last known position was here. We'll start our search radius from this point." As they prepared to head out, a park volunteer burst in. "We've got a hiker at the visitor center. Says he heard screams in the backcountry yesterday afternoon." Mike's face paled. "Where?" The volunteer pointed to an area on the map, not far from Sophie's last known location. Mike's gut twisted. "That settles it. We're dealing with a potential emergency situation." He turned to his team. "Sarah, you're with me on ground search. Tom, coordinate with air support. I want a chopper in the area ASAP." As they moved out, Mike couldn't shake a sense of dread. "Hold on, Sophie," he muttered. "We're coming." The search party split into 3 teams, each taking a different section of the dense forest. Mike and Sarah pushed through thick underbrush, calling Sophie's name. Hours passed with no sign. The forest seemed to swallow their voices. "Mike," Sarah called, waving him over. "Look at this." On a tree trunk, 3 deep gashes cut into the bark. "Fresh." "There," Mike said grimly. "And a big one." They pressed on, now searching not just for Sophie, but for any sign of bear activity. The weight of urgency pressed down on them. As dusk approached, Mike's radio crackled. "Base to ground team." Choppers picked up a faint emergency beacon signal. "Sending coordinates now." Mike's heart raced. That's gotta be her. All teams converge on those coordinates. They pushed through the gathering darkness, flashlights scanning the forest floor. Suddenly, Sarah gasped. "Mike, over here." In the beam of her flashlight, a splash of color stood out against the forest floor. Sophie's backpack, torn and bloodied. Mike's voice shook as he radioed in. Ace, we found evidence of a possible bear attack. Request immediate medical evac. The sound of helicopter blades filled the air as the search intensified. Every ranger knew they were in a race against time. Sophie, Mike called, his voice hoarse. Dr. Lang, can you hear us? A faint sound caught Sarah's attention. Wait, listen. In the distance, a low growl rumbled through the trees. Mike and Sarah exchanged a look of dread. The bear's still here, Sarah whispered. They approached cautiously, weapons ready. The growling grew louder. Suddenly, the bushes parted. A massive grizzly burst into view, charging straight at them. Fire, Mike yelled. Shots rang out. The bear stumbled, then collapsed mere feet from them. As the echo of gunshots faded, a weak voice called out from above. Help! Mike's flashlight beam found Sophie, clinging to a tree branch, barely conscious. We've got her, he shouted into his radio. Send in the chopper for immediate evac. Sarah climbed up, securing Sophie with a harness. You're safe now, Dr. Lang. We're getting you out of here. As they lowered her, Sophie mumbled deliriously. The bear! It kept coming back. Mike surveyed her injuries, his face grim. She's lost a lot of blood. We need to move fast. The helicopter descended, its downdraft whipping through the trees. As they loaded Sophie onto a stretcher, Mike held her hand. Stay with us, Sophie. You're going to be okay. In the chopper, paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her. Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness, the hum of the helicopter blades a surreal backdrop to her ordeal. Back at the ranger station, a crowd had gathered. News of the bear attack and dramatic rescue spread quickly. As the helicopter touched down, medical teams rushed Sophie into a waiting ambulance. Mike watched it speed away, lights flashing. He turned to his team, exhaustion etched on every face. Great work, everyone. We got her out alive. Sarah nodded, then gestured to the forest. What about the bear? Mike sighed heavily. We'll send a team to recover the body in the morning. For now, that area's off limits. As the adrenaline of the rescue faded, the reality of the situation sank in. They'd saved Sophie, but the encounter raised serious questions about bear management in the park. Mike knew there would be an investigation, reports to file, decisions to make. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of relief. They'd beaten the odds. Sophie was alive. In the hospital, doctors worked through the night to treat Sophie's extensive injuries. Outside her room, Mike waited for news, replaying the events in his mind. When the doctor finally emerged, Mike stood anxiously. How is she? The doctor's face was serious but hopeful. She's stable. The next 24 hours will be critical, but Dr. Lang is a fighter. She's got a long recovery ahead, but I believe she'll pull through. Mike nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He looked out the window at the distant mountains of Yellowstone. Somewhere out there, a forest was waking up, its dangers and beauty unchanged by the drama that had unfolded. For Sophie, the ordeal was over, but its echoes would ripple through the park, a stark reminder of the wild heart still beating in this supposedly tamed wilderness. The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the air as Dr. Sophie Lang drifted in and out of consciousness. Her body, battered and broken, fought against the trauma it had endured. In her fleeting moments of lucidity, the terrifying images of the bear attack flashed through her mind. Outside her hospital room, Head Ranger Mike Townsend paced anxiously. The doctor's words echoed in his head. The next 24 hours are critical. Sarah Chun, his deputy, approached with 2 cups of coffee. Any tines? She asked, handing him a cup. Mike shook his head. No, she's still unconscious. The doctors are worried about infections setting in. Sarah sighed. Mike, we need to get back to the park. There's a situation developing. What now? Mike asked, rubbing his tired eyes. To bear, it's been spotted again, near a popular hiking trail. Mike's face hardened. Damn it, we can't risk another attack. We need to organize a team to track and tranquilize it immediately. As they rushed back to Yellowstone, Sophie's condition took a turn for the worse. Her fever spiked, and alarms blared as her vitals became erratic. Dr. Emily Zhao, the lead physician, barked orders to her team. She's going into septic shock. We need to get her to the ER now. In the operating room, Dr. Zhao worked feverishly to clean Sophie's wounds and stop the spread of infection. Come on, Dr. Lang, she muttered. You've made it this far. Don't give up now. Meanwhile, back in Yellowstone, Mike briefed a team of wildlife experts and rangers. Our priority is public safety, he emphasized. But remember, this bear is also a vital part of the ecosystem. We tranquilize and relocate only as a last resort. As the team ventured into the backcountry, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on them. They knew they were racing not just to prevent another potential attack, but also against Sophie's deteriorating condition back at the hospital. Hours passed as they tracked the bear through dense forest and rocky terrain. Suddenly, a radio crackled to life. Base to search team. We've got a visual on the bear. It's heading towards Lupin Meadow. Mike's heart raced. That's a popular spot for hikers. We need to intercept it now. The team double-timed it through the underbrush, the sound of snapping twigs and heavy breathing filling the air. As they reached the edge of the meadow, they saw it, the massive grizzly. Its fur still matted with blood, Sophie's blood. Everyone in position, Mike whispered into his radio. Wait for my signal. The bear, unaware of their presence, ambled through the tall grass. Mike raised his tranquilizer gun, taking careful aim. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, a family of hikers emerged on the other side of the meadow. Lo, Sarah hissed. We can't risk hitting them. The bear's head snapped up, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the hikers. Time seemed to stand still as everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment of tense silence, Mike's radio suddenly crackled to life. Ranger Townsend, this is Yellowstone Medical. We have an update on Dr. Lang. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He knew he couldn't take the call now, not with lives potentially at stake. But the weight of not knowing Sophie's fate pressed down on him like a physical force. The bear took a step towards the oblivious hikers. Mike made a split-second decision. Take the shot, he ordered. Multiple tranquilizer darts flew through the air. The bear roared in confusion and pain as they found their mark. It stumbled, taking a few more lumbering steps before finally collapsing in the meadow. The hikers, finally noticing the commotion, stood frozen in shock. Sarah rushed over to escort them safely away while the rest of the team secured the unconscious bear. As the adrenaline of the moment faded, Mike finally had a chance to check his radio. This is Ranger Townsend. What's the update on Dr. Lang? There was a pause before the response came. Dr. Lang is out of surgery. She's still critical but stable. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. Mike let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. As the team prepared to transport the tranquilized bear to a remote location for relocation, Mike couldn't help but reflect on the parallel struggles. Sophie fighting for her life in the hospital, and this wild creature, now at their mercy. What do we do with it? Sarah asked, gesturing to the bear. Mike sighed heavily. We follow protocol, relocated far from any human settlements, and we pray it doesn't find its way back. As the sun began to set over the Yellowstone landscape, casting long shadows across the meadow, Mike felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. They had prevented another potential tragedy. But at what cost? The delicate balance between human safety and wildlife conservation had never felt more precarious. Back in the hospital, Sophie's eyes fluttered open for the first time since her surgery. Through the haze of pain medication, she saw Dr. Zhao checking her vitals. "The bear," Sophie croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it?" Dr. Zhao gently squeezed her hand. "Don't worry about that now, Dr. Lang. You're safe. You need to focus on healing." As Sophie drifted back to sleep, her dreams were a swirl of dense forests, gleaming claws, and the distant sound of helicopter blades. Somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, a part of her knew that her ordeal had forever changed her relationship with the wilderness she had dedicated her life to studying. Miles away, in a remote corner of the park, the tranquilized bear was released. As it lumbered away into the gathering darkness, Mike watched with a mix of awe and trepidation. The incident would spark debates about wildlife management policies, human encroachment on natural habitats, and the unpredictable nature of wild animals. But for now, as the last light faded from the sky, there was a moment of uneasy peace. Sophie was alive, the bear was free, and Yellowstone, in all its brutal beauty, continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the dramas that played out within its borders. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the first sound Sophie Lang registered as she slowly drifted back to consciousness. Her eyelids felt heavy, but she managed to pry them open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. "Welcome back, Dr. Lang," a gentle voice said from beside her. Sophie turned her head slightly, wincing at the pain the small movement caused. Dr. Emily Zhao stood there, checking her vitals with a relieved smile. How long?" Sophie croaked, her throat dry and scratchy. "You've been in and out for about a week," Dr. Zhao replied, offering her a small sip of water. "You gave us quite a scare, but you're on the mend now." As the fog in her mind began to clear, flashes of the bear attack came rushing back. Sophie's heart rate spiked, causing the monitor to beep more rapidly. "Easy," Dr. Zhao soothed, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You're safe now. The bear can't hurt you anymore." Sophie took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "The bear? What happened to it?" Dr. Zhao hesitated for a moment. "I think it's best if we focus on your recovery for now. There will be time for all of that later." Over the next few days, Sophie's condition steadily improved. Her wounds were healing well, though the deep gashes left by the bear's claws would undoubtedly leave permanent scars. Physical therapists began working with her, helping her regain strength and mobility. One afternoon, as Sophie was attempting to walk a short distance with the aid of a walker, Head Ranger Mike Townsend appeared in the doorway of her room. "Dr. Lang," he said warmly, "it's good to see you up and about." Sophie managed a small smile. "Mike, it's good to see you too. I hear I have you and your team to thank for my rescue." Mike shook his head modestly. "We just did our job. You're the one who survived out there against all odds." As Sophie settled back into her bed, exhausted from the short walk, Mike pulled up a chair beside her. "Sophie," he began, his tone turning serious, "I know you've been asking about the bear. I thought you deserved to hear what happened directly from me." Sophie tensed, bracing herself for the news. Mike continued, "After we rescued you, the bear was spotted again near a popular hiking trail. We had to intervene to prevent another potential attack. We successfully tranquilized and relocated it to a remote area of the park." Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "So it's still alive?" Mike nodded. "Yes, but I have to be honest with you, Sophie. There's been a lot of debate about how to handle the situation. Some are calling for more aggressive measures if the bear returns to populated areas." Sophie closed her eyes, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the bear was alive, fear at the thought of it potentially harming others, and a surprising twinge of empathy for the creature that had nearly killed her. "I understand," she said softly. "It's a difficult balance." Mike leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Your perspective on this could be valuable, Sophie. Once you're feeling up to it, the Park Service would like to get your official statement about the incident." Sophie nodded, though the thought of reliving the attack made her stomach churn. "Of course, whatever I can do to help." As Mike left, Sophie found herself lost in thought. The attack had shattered her sense of security in the wilderness she loved, but it had also given her a new perspective on the raw power and unpredictability of nature. Weeks passed, and Sophie's physical recovery progressed steadily. However, the psychological scars ran deep. Nightmares plagued her sleep, filled with gleaming claws and hot, fetid breaths. During the day, sudden noises would make her jump, her heart racing as if the bear were about to burst through the hospital walls. Dr. Zhao recognized the signs of post-traumatic stress and arranged for Sophie to begin sessions with Dr. Rachel Chun, a trauma specialist. In one of their early sessions, Dr. Chun gently probed Sophie's feelings about the attack. It's common for survivors of animal attacks to experience a range of emotions, including fear, anger, and even guilt. "Can you tell me what you're feeling?" Sophie stared out the window, watching a pair of birds flit between the branches of a nearby tree. "I'm angry," she admitted. "Not at the bear exactly. It was just being a bear. I'm angry at myself for being careless, for thinking I could predict and control nature." Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "That's a very insightful observation, Sophie. How has this experience changed your view of your work?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment. "I've dedicated my life to studying these animals, to understanding them. But in those moments when the bear was attacking me, all my knowledge meant nothing. I was just prey." As the sessions continued, Sophie slowly began to process her trauma. She learned coping mechanisms for her anxiety and techniques to ground herself when memories of the attack threatened to overwhelm her. One day, about 2 months after the attack, Sophie received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Chun, Mike's deputy ranger, appeared at her hospital room door. "Dr. Lang," Sarah greeted her with a smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Sophie shook her head. "Not at all. Please, come in." Sarah sat down, looking a bit uncomfortable. "I wanted to bring you something," she said. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a familiar notebook, its pages wrinkled and stained. "We found this at your campsite. I thought you might want it back." Sophie's breath caught as she took the notebook. It was her field journal, filled with her observations and data from the days leading up to the attack. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling a connection to her former self, the scientist who had ventured into the wilderness with such confidence. "Thank you," Sophie said softly. "This means a lot." Sarah nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Dr. Alan, Sophie, I also wanted to ask you something. The park is planning an educational program about bear safety for visitors. We were hoping you might consider being involved once you're fully recovered. Your experience, well, it could really drive home the importance of proper precautions in bear country." Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering the request. The thought of reliving her experience was daunting, but she also saw the potential to prevent others from going through what she had. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Thank you for considering me." As Sarah left, Sophie opened her notebook, losing herself in the pages of scientific observations and sketches. It was a bittersweet reminder of her passion for wildlife biology, now complicated by her traumatic experience. The following week, Sophie was finally cleared to leave the hospital. As she packed up her few belongings, Dr. Zhao came to say goodbye. "Remember, Sophie," she said, "recovery is not just physical. Be patient with yourself as you adjust to life outside these walls." Sophie nodded, grateful for the doctor's care. "I will. Thank you for everything." As she was wheeled out of the hospital, Sophie was struck by the brightness of the sun, the vividness of the colors around her. The world seemed somehow both more beautiful and more dangerous than she remembered. Her parents had flown in to drive her back to her apartment near Yellowstone. The car ride was quiet, the weight of unspoken worries hanging in the air. "Honey," her mother finally said, turning in her seat to look at Sophie. "Are you sure you want to go back to your apartment? You could come stay with us for a while, just until you're feeling more yourself." Sophie appreciated the concern, but she knew she needed to face her fears head-on. "Thanks, Mom, but I need to do this. My life is here. My work is here." Her father's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Your work," he said carefully. "Sophie, have you thought about doing something else? Something safer?" Sophie felt a flare of defensiveness, but she tamped it down. She knew her parents were just worried about her. "Dad, I know you're concerned, but this is who I am. The attack. It's changed me, yes, but it hasn't changed my passion for wildlife biology. If anything, it's made me more committed to understanding and protecting these animals." The conversation lapsed back into silence, but Sophie could sense her parents' unease. She knew it would take time for all of them to come to terms with what had happened. As they pulled up to her apartment building, Sophie felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This was the first step towards reclaiming her life, but she knew the road ahead would not be easy. Over the next few weeks, Sophie focused on her physical therapy and continued her sessions with Dr. Chun. She also began reviewing her research notes, determined not to let her work go to waste. One evening, as she was poring over her data, her phone rang. It was Mike Townsend. "Sophie," he said, his voice tight with tension, "I thought you should hear this from me first. The bear. It's been spotted again, not far from where it attacked you." Sophie's heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. Has it hurt anyone?" "No," Mike assured her quickly. "Not yet, but its behavior is concerning. It seems to have lost its fear of humans. We're monitoring the situation closely." "Fine. Sophie, there's talk of euthanizing it if it becomes a clear threat to public safety." Sophie closed her eyes, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. "I understand," she said softly. "Thank you for letting me know." After hanging up, Sophie sat in silence for a long time, her mind churning. The bear that had nearly killed her was out there, potentially a threat to others. Yet she couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the animal, a shared trauma that linked them. In that moment, Sophie made a decision. She picked up her phone and dialed Sarah Chen's number. "Sarah? The Sophie Lang. About that educational program on bear safety. I'm in. But I want to do more than just share my story. I want to be involved in developing new strategies for human-wildlife coexistence in the park." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Sarah's voice came through, filled with surprise and enthusiasm. "That's fantastic, Sophie. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sophie took a deep breath, feeling more certain than she had in months. "I'm sure. This experience has shown me how crucial it is to bridge the gap between scientific research and public safety. We need to find a way to protect both humans and wildlife." As she hung up the phone, Sophie felt a sense of purpose wash over her. The attack had nearly broken her, but it had also given her a unique perspective, one that she could use to make a difference. She opened her laptop and began to type, outlining her ideas for new research projects and educational initiatives. The fear was still there, a constant presence in the back of her mind, but now it was tempered by determination. Sophie knew that her recovery, both physical and emotional, was far from over. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and lingering trauma to contend with. But as she looked out her window at the distant silhouette of the Yellowstone Mountains, she felt a glimmer of hope. The wilderness that had nearly claimed her life was still out there, wild and unpredictable. But now, Sophie was determined to use her experience to foster a deeper understanding between humans and the natural world. It would be a long journey, but she was ready to take the first step. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Sophie made a promise to herself. She would face her fears, continue her work, and strive to create a future where humans and wildlife could coexist more safely and harmoniously. The bear's attack had changed her life forever, but it hadn't defeated her. In the end, it had given her a new mission, one that would shape her career and potentially save both human and animal lives in the years to come. With a deep breath, Sophie turned back to her work, ready to begin the next chapter of her life, one where she would use her hard-won knowledge to become a bridge between two worlds, working tirelessly to protect the delicate balance between human safety and wildlife conservation in the untamed wilderness she called home. Ethan Rodriguez zipped up his parka, his breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Banff National Park stretched before him, a winter wonderland slowly awakening to spring's touch. He shouldered his heavy backpack, snowshoes crunching on the fresh powder. "Mr. Rodriguez, a word before you head out," called Park Ranger Sarah Thompson, jogging towards him. Ethan turned, curiosity peaking. "What's up, Ranger Thompson?" Sarah's face was etched with concern. "We've had reports of unusual bear activity. The early thaw is bringing them out of hibernation sooner than expected. They're hungry and potentially aggressive." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Bears? This early?" Sarah nodded grimly. "Climate change is messing with their patterns. We're advising extreme caution. Maybe consider postponing your trip." Ethan glanced at the wilderness beyond, then back at Sarah. His voice carried a hint of cockiness. "I appreciate the warning, but I've dealt with bears before. I'll be extra vigilant." Sarah frowned. "Your call, but please take this seriously. These aren't your average encounters." "Will do," Ethan replied, adjusting his GoPro. "This'll make for one hell of a blog post." As Ethan set off, Sarah watched him disappear into the trees, an uneasy feeling settling in her gut. The day passed uneventfully as Ethan trekked through the snow-laden landscape. The beauty was breathtaking: pristine white slopes, towering pines, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. He narrated his journey for his followers, describing the scenery and his planned route. "Day 1, and it's absolutely stunning out here, guys." Ethan spoke into his camera. "The snow's deep, but nothing these bad boys can't handle." He panned down to his snowshoes. As the sun began to dip, Ethan searched for a suitable campsite. He found a small clearing nestled against a rocky outcropping, offering some protection from the wind. "Home sweet home for the night," Ethan announced, setting up his tent with practiced efficiency. He hung his food bag high in a nearby tree, well away from his sleeping area. As darkness fell, Ethan huddled in his sleeping bag, the cold seeping through despite his layers. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of snow. Miles away, deep in the heart of the park, a massive grizzly bear stirred in its den. Hunger gnawed at its belly, rousing it from slumber weeks earlier than usual. The bear's nose twitched, catching the faintest scent of potential prey on the wind. With a low growl, the grizzly emerged from its den, shaking off months of torpor. Its powerful muscles rippled beneath its thick fur as it lumbered through the snow, following the tantalizing scent of food. Back at his campsite, Ethan tossed and turned, unable to shake a growing sense of unease. The warnings from Ranger Thompson echoed in his mind, mixing with the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. "Get a grip, Ethan," he muttered to himself. "You've done this 100 times." But as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a distant, guttural sound, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this time was different. This time, he wasn't just an observer of nature's wild beauty. He was prey. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, each crack and rustle amplified in Ethan's hyper-aware state. When dawn finally broke, he emerged from his tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. "Rough night, folks," Ethan spoke softly into his camera, forcing a smile. But that's all part of the adventure, right? Today, we push deeper into bear country. As Ethan packed up his camp, he failed to notice the large, fresh paw prints circling just beyond the tree line, a silent warning of the danger that lurked in the awakening wilderness. Ethan trudged through the snow, his snowshoes leaving deep imprints. The crisp morning air nipped at his exposed skin as he followed a frozen creek. Day 2, folks, he narrated to his camera. Heading deeper into... He stopped abruptly, noticing something in the snow. Soldak, are those bear tracks? Ethan crouched, examining the massive paw prints. His heart raced as he realized their size and freshness. These are grizzly tracks, and they're new. Real new. Miles away, the grizzly's nose twitched. It caught Ethan's scent on the wind, a mixture of sweat and artificial odors. Hunger drove it forward. Ethan continued cautiously, hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every snapping twig made him flinch. He tried to maintain his adventurous facade for the camera, but his voice trembled. Staying alert, guys. Remember, if you encounter a grizzly, make yourself big and... A low growl interrupted him. Ethan froze, slowly turning towards the sound. Through the trees, he glimpsed a massive brown form. The bear's eyes locked onto his. "Oh God," Ethan whispered, fumbling with his bear spray. The grizzly disappeared into the undergrowth as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. "Okay, that just happened," he said shakily to the camera. I'm heading back to camp. Now." Ethan retraced his steps, constantly looking over his shoulder. The forest, once beautiful, now seemed menacing. Every shadow could hide the bear. Back at camp, Ethan paced nervously. "What do I do?" he muttered. "Turn back? No, it's too far. Maybe if I..." A twig snapped nearby. Ethan whirled around, spray ready. Nothing, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As night fell, Ethan huddled in his tent, every sound amplified by his fear. Sleep eluded him as the grizzly's image played on repeat in his mind. Outside, unseen in the darkness, the bear circled. It was patient, it was hungry, and it had found its prey. Ethan fortified his camp as darkness fell, his hands shaking as he tied extra guy lines. Sleep eluded him, every sound amplified by fear. A deep growl pierced the night. Ethan's breath caught. "It's back," he whispered. The bear circled, its heavy footfalls crunching snow. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Two gleaming eyes reflected back. "Hey, get out of here," Ethan shouted, voice cracking. He banged pots together, the clanging echoing through the forest. The bear retreated, but Ethan knew it wasn't far. Ethan kept a vigil, exhaustion and terror warring within him. Dawn broke, revealing destruction. His food cache was torn apart, supplies scattered. Ethan filmed the damage, his voice hoarse. "I can't stay here. It's not safe." He packed quickly, constantly scanning for danger. The weight of eyes upon him never left. "I'm heading back," Ethan announced to his camera. "This is beyond my skills." As he shouldered his pack, a low growl froze him in place. The bear was close, too close. Ethan ran, abandoning caution. The chase had begun. Ethan bolted through the snow, his heart pounding. The bear's growls echoed behind him. "This can't be happening," he gasped, fumbling with his camera. "I'm being chased by a grizzly." He spotted a frozen lake ahead. "Maybe I can lose it there." Ethan stepped onto the ice, moving cautiously. Cracks spider-webbed beneath his feet. "Oh God! Oh God!" he muttered, inching forward. The bear appeared at the shore, hesitating. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The grizzly began to circle the lake. Halfway across, Ethan heard a loud crack. The ice was breaking. He quickened his pace, panic rising. "Come on, come on," he urged himself, the shore tantalizingly close. As he neared the edge, the ice gave way. Ethan plunged into the frigid water, gasping for air. He clawed his way onto solid ground, soaked and shivering. The bear was nowhere in sight, but Ethan knew the reprieve was temporary. Hypothermia setting in, he stumbled towards the trees. "Need shelter," he mumbled, his vision blurring. A roar shattered the silence. The bear had found him again. Ethan tried to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He fell, snow cushioning his fall. As darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, Ethan saw the massive form of the grizzly approaching. "This is it," he thought, closing his eyes. "This is how it ends." Ethan stumbled to his feet, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. The grizzly charged, closing the distance rapidly. "No!" Ethan screamed, fumbling for his bear spray. The bear slammed into him, knocking him down. Claws raked his back. "Help!" Ethan cried, struggling beneath the massive weight. He managed to twist, spraying the bear's face. It recoiled, roaring in pain. Ethan scrambled away, clothes torn and bleeding. The bear shook its head, momentarily disoriented. Seizing his chance, Ethan fled into dense forest. Branches whipped his face as he ran blindly. Behind him, the bear's angry roars spurred him on. Pain and terror consumed him. Ethan spotted a narrow gap between boulders. He squeezed through, praying the bear couldn't follow. The grizzly's massive paw swiped at the opening, inches from Ethan's face. He pressed deeper into the crevice, trembling. For hours, Ethan remained trapped, the bear circling outside. As night fell, the growls finally receded. Cautiously, Ethan emerged. "I'm alive," he whispered, disbelieving. Injured and disoriented, he limped deeper into the wilderness. The bear's presence a constant, unseen threat. Ethan stumbled through the dense forest, each step sending waves of pain through his battered body. Blood seeped from the deep gashes on his back, staining his tattered jacket. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air. "Got to keep moving," he panted, his voice barely above a whisper. The adrenaline from the bear attack was wearing off, leaving him shaky and disoriented. He paused, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. With trembling hands, he reached for his backpack, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. Most of his supplies were gone, lost in the frantic escape across the frozen lake. "Okay, Ethan, think," he muttered to himself. "First aid. You need first aid." He rummaged through what remained of his pack, finding a small first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Ethan cleaned his wounds as best he could with antiseptic wipes. "This is going to hurt," he warned himself, before pouring some of his precious drinking water over the gashes. The pain was excruciating, and he bit down on his sleeve to muffle his scream. As he bandaged himself with shaking hands, Ethan's ears strained for any sound of pursuit. The forest was eerily quiet, but he knew the bear was out there, still hunting him. "Got to find shelter," he said, forcing himself to his feet. The light was fading fast, and with night would come dangerously low temperatures. Ethan trudged on, each step a monumental effort. His eyes scanned the landscape, searching for anything that could offer protection from the elements and concealment from predators. After what felt like hours, he spotted a small opening in a rocky hillside. "Please be empty," he prayed, approaching cautiously. The cave was shallow but dry. Ethan crawled inside, his body screaming in protest. He collapsed on the cold stone floor, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. "No, can't sleep yet," he mumbled, fighting to stay conscious. He knew he needed to try to warm up and secure the entrance somehow. Using the last of his strength, Ethan gathered some fallen branches and positioned them across the cave opening. It wasn't much, but it might give him a few precious seconds of warning if the bear found him. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Ethan huddled in the deepest part of the cave, shivering violently. He had no fire, no warm clothing, and only a few sips of water left. "Someone will find me," he whispered, trying to convince himself. "The rangers know I'm out here. They'll come looking." But as the hours crawled by, doubt crept in. The park was vast and he was far off his planned route. Would anyone know where to look? In the distance, a low growl echoed through the trees. Ethan's heart raced. The bear was still out there, still hunting. "Go away," he pleaded softly, tears streaming down his face. "Trees, just go away." The night seemed endless. Every sound, every shadow made Ethan flinch. He drifted in and out of consciousness, pain and cold jolting him awake each time. As dawn broke, Ethan peered out of his meager shelter. The forest was shrouded in mist, silent and foreboding. He knew he couldn't stay in the cave forever, but the thought of venturing out filled him with dread. "What do I do?" he asked the empty air, his voice cracking. "Which way do I go?" His survival training seemed like a distant memory. Overwhelmed by pain and fear, Ethan closed his eyes, trying to think rationally. "Water," he decided finally. "I need to find water." Gathering what little courage he had left, Ethan prepared to leave his temporary sanctuary. He listened intently for any sign of the bear, but heard only the whisper of wind through the trees. As he stepped out of the cave, a twig snapped nearby. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned towards the sound. There, not 20 feet away, stood the grizzly. Its eyes locked onto Ethan, filled with primal hunger. "No," Ethan breathed, backing towards the cave. "No, no, no." The bear rose to its full height, letting out a deafening roar. Ethan scrambled back into the cave, knowing it was no real protection against the determined predator. As the sound of heavy paws approached, Ethan closed his eyes. He thought of his family, his friends, all the things he'd left unsaid. "I'm sorry," he whispered, as the bear's shadow fell across the cave entrance. "I'm so sorry." Ranger Sarah Thompson frowned as she surveyed the abandoned campsite. Ethan Rodriguez's bright blue tent stood empty, his gear scattered haphazardly around the clearing. "This isn't right," she muttered, crouching to examine a set of massive paw prints in the snow. "Rodriguez," she called out, her voice echoing through the trees. No response. Sarah keyed her radio. "Ace, this is Thompson. We've got a situation." "Go ahead, Thompson," crackled the reply. "Rodriguez's camp is abandoned. Signs of bear activity. No sign of the hiker. Requesting full search and rescue mobilization." There was a pause before the radio came to life again. "Copy that, Thompson. SAR team is being assembled. Hold position and secure the site." As Sarah began marking off the area with caution tape, to partner, Ranger Mike Chun emerged from the tree-line. "Anything?" Sarah asked, hope tinging her voice. Mike shook his head grimly. "Nothing good. Found some blood on the snow about a quarter-mile east. And more bear tracks." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Damn it. I knew we shouldn't have let him go out alone." Back at the ranger station, a flurry of activity erupted as the search and rescue operation kicked into high gear. Maps were unfurled, teams assembled, and gear checked. Park Superintendent Janet Reeves addressed the gathered rescue workers, her face etched with concern. "We've got a missing hiker, potentially injured, in grizzly territory. Time is critical. Our priority is to find Ethan Rodriguez and get him to safety." As the teams prepared to head out, a park official made a difficult phone call. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is David Carter from Banff National Park. I'm afraid I have some concerning news about your son, Deason." Maria Rodriguez's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "What's happened to my boy?" David took a deep breath. "Ethan has gone missing during his solo hiking trip. We've initiated a full-scale search and rescue operation." Maria's sob was audible even through the phone. "Oh God, no. Please, you have to find him. We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Rodriguez. I promise you we won't stop until we locate Ethan." As dawn broke the next day, the search intensified. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotors battling against strong winds. In the cockpit of the lead chopper, pilot Alex Novak scanned the endless expanse of white below. "This weather's not making things easy," he shouted over the engine noise to his co-pilot. "Keep looking," came the terse reply. "He's got to be out there somewhere." On the ground, search teams fanned out, following trails and checking every possible shelter. Ranger Sarah led one such team, her face set with determination. "Remember," she briefed her team, "we're not just looking for Ethan. Keep an eye out for that grizzly. Could still be in the area." As the day wore on, frustration mounted. Despite their best efforts, there was no sign of Ethan. Back at the command center, Superintendent Reeves pored over maps, plotting each team's progress. Her phone rang, displaying a number she'd come to dread. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she answered, steeling herself. "Have you found him?" Maria's voice was small, hopeful. Janet closed her eyes, hating what she had to say. "Not yet, but I assure you we're not giving up. Our teams are working around the clock." "He's alive," Maria insisted. "I can feel it. My Ethan is a survivor." "We believe that too, Mrs. Rodriguez. We'll keep searching until we bring him home." As night fell, the search teams reluctantly returned to base, exhausted and disheartened. Plans were made for the next day's efforts with an expanded search area. In the early hours of the morning, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A wildlife camera, set up to monitor animal movements, had captured a distant figure stumbling through the snow. "It's him," Sarah exclaimed, examining the grainy footage. "Muck, that's got to be Rodriguez." The discovery energized the rescue teams. Helicopters were scrambled, their searchlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. In one chopper, Alex Novak banked hard, responding to a crackling radio call. "All units, this is Ranger Thompson. We've got a visual on what looks like a campfire. Grid reference Charlie 7. "Roger that," Alex responded, adjusting his course. "ETA 3 minutes." As the helicopter approached the coordinates, its spotlight illuminated a small cave entrance. And there, huddled against the rock, was a figure. "There!" the co-pilot shouted, pointing. "By the cave." But as the chopper drew closer, another shape emerged from the treeline. A massive grizzly bear, drawn by the noise and light, was advancing on the cave. "Oh no," Alex breathed, realizing the danger. "Base, this is Novak. We've located Rodriguez, but there's a bear on site, requesting immediate ground support and animal control." The next few moments were chaos. The helicopter hovered low, its downdraft and noise aimed at scaring off the bear. On the ground, Ethan looked up, hope and terror warring on his face as he saw both rescue and danger approaching. As the bear reared up, roaring in confusion and anger, a ground team burst into the clearing. Ranger Sarah raised her rifle, loaded with tranquilizer darts. "Hold on, Ethan," she shouted, taking aim. "We're here." The dart found its mark, but the bear didn't go down immediately. It turned, confused and angry, swinging its massive paws at the approaching rescuers. In that moment of distraction, 2 team members rushed to Ethan, shielding him with their bodies. "We've got you," one yelled over the noise. "You're safe now." As the bear finally succumbed to the tranquilizer, collapsing in the snow, the clearing erupted in activity. Medical personnel swarmed around Ethan, assessing his injuries and preparing him for evacuation. Sarah approached, her eyes wide with relief and concern. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears of relief. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words were clear. "You found me. You really found me." As the rescue helicopter lifted off, carrying Ethan to safety, at first, rays of sunlight broke over the mountains. The long night was over. Against all odds, Ethan Rodriguez had survived. Ethan huddled in the small cave, his body racked with shivers. The icy wind howled outside, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls crunching through snow. He knew the bear had found him again. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice hoarse from dehydration and fear. His eyes darted around the cave, searching desperately for anything he could use to defend himself. In the dim light, he spotted a few branches he had gathered earlier in a futile attempt to start a fire. His numb fingers closed around one, hefting it like a club. It felt pitifully inadequate against the massive predator outside. The growling grew louder. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he saw the bear's enormous silhouette fill the cave entrance. Its hot breath steamed in the frigid air as it sniffed, catching Ethan's scent. "Stay back," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. He waved the branch frantically, hoping to deter the bear, but the grizzly, driven by hunger and territorial instinct, was undeterred. As the bear lumbered into the cave, Ethan's survival instinct kicked in. With trembling hands, he reached for his backpack, fumbling for his last resort, a small emergency flare. Please work," he muttered, struggling to ignite it with his frozen fingers. The bear was mere feet away now, its powerful jaws open in a terrifying snarl. Just as the grizzly reared up on its hind legs, Ethan managed to light the flare. The cave was suddenly bathed in harsh, red light. The bear, startled by the sudden brightness and hissing of the flare, stumbled backward. Seizing his chance, Ethan waved the flare wildly, the sparks flying dangerously close to his own face. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "Get out!" The bear, confused and frightened by the fire, retreated towards the cave entrance. But Ethan knew this reprieve would be short-lived. As soon as the flare died out, the bear would likely return, more agitated than before. With the last of his strength, Ethan formulated a desperate plan. He needed to make a run for it, to find somewhere, anywhere, that might offer better protection or a chance of rescue. As the flare sputtered, its light dimming, Ethan steeled himself. "Now or never," he whispered. The moment the flare went out, plunging the cave back into darkness, Ethan bolted. He ducked under the bear's massive form, feeling its fur brush against him as he sprinted out of the cave. The sudden movement caught the grizzly off guard. For a precious few seconds, it hesitated, giving Ethan a head start. But then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains, it gave chase. Ethan ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping his face, roots threatening to trip him at every step. The sound of the bear crashing through the underbrush behind him spurred him on, pushing his battered body beyond its limits. "Help!" he screamed as he ran, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, might cheer him. "Somebody help me!" As he burst through a thicket, Ethan found himself at the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was dizzying, but he could hear the sound of running water below. A river. The bear's roar sounded again, closer this time. Ethan knew he had only seconds to decide. "Oh God!" he breathed, looking down at the swirling waters below. It was a desperate move, but it was his only chance. Just as the bear crashed through the trees behind him, Ethan jumped. For a heart-stopping moment, he was in free fall, the icy air rushing past him. Then he hit the water with a shocking impact that drove the air from his lungs. The current immediately swept him downstream, away from the bear, which paced furiously at the top of the ravine. Ethan struggled to keep his head above water, gasping for air as the frigid river tossed him like a rag doll. "Cold. So cold," he chattered, his limbs growing numb. He knew hypothermia would set in quickly. He had to get out of the water. As he was swept around a bend, Ethan spotted a large tree that had fallen across the river. With the last of his strength, he reached out, his fingers closing around a branch. Slowly, painfully, he dragged himself out of the water and onto the trunk of the fallen tree. He lay there, shivering uncontrollably, too exhausted to move further. From his precarious perch, Ethan could see the bear pacing along the riverbank, searching for a way down. But the steep sides of the ravine seemed to be keeping it at bay, at least for now. As the adrenaline wore off, the full extent of Ethan's injuries and exhaustion hit him. His vision began to blur, unconsciousness threatening to overtake him. He knew that if he passed out here, exposed to the elements, he would likely never wake up. With monumental effort, Ethan forced himself to move. He crawled along the tree trunk until he reached the opposite bank. There, nestled between the roots of a large pine, he found a small hollow. Ethan curled up in this meager shelter, his body shaking with cold and fatigue. He knew he should try to make a fire to signal for help, to do something. But he had nothing left. No strength, no supplies, no hope. As darkness began to fall, Ethan thought he heard a distant sound, a rhythmic thumping that seemed out of place in the wilderness. It grew louder, more distinct. Helicopter, he realized with a start. Search and rescue. With the last reserves of his strength, Ethan crawled out of his hiding place. He waved his arms weakly, his voice a hoarse whisper as he tried to shout. The sound grew louder, and then, miraculously, a beam of light cut through the gathering gloom. It swept across the ravine once, twice, and then settled on Ethan's position. As the helicopter hovered overhead, Ethan saw figures being lowered on ropes. Help had arrived at last, but even as relief flooded through him, Ethan heard a familiar roar. The bear had found a way down the ravine and was charging towards him. "No," Ethan moaned, too weak to move. "Please, no." The rescue team, seeing the approaching danger, worked with frantic speed. A rescuer reached Ethan just as the bear closed in. "Hang on," the rescuer shouted, securing Ethan to a harness. As they were lifted into the air, Ethan saw another team member fire something at the bear, a tranquilizer dart. The last thing Ethan saw before he finally lost consciousness was the massive form of the grizzly stumbling, then collapsing in the snow. As darkness took him, Ethan allowed himself to believe, for the first time in days, that he might actually survive this ordeal. The helicopter rose into the darkening sky, carrying Ethan to safety, leaving behind the wilderness that had almost claimed his life. The bear, temporarily subdued, would soon shake off the effects of the tranquilizer and disappear back into the vast, unforgiving landscape of Banff National Park, a reminder of the raw, untamed power of nature. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the hospital room as Ethan Rodriguez slowly opened his eyes. The stark white ceiling came into focus, a stark contrast to the dark forests he had been trapped in for days. He blinked, trying to orient himself. "Deason? Oh, thank God." His mother's voice, thick with emotion, came from beside him. Maria Rodriguez grasped his hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're awake, mi hijo." Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. A nurse quickly appeared, offering him ice chips. As the cold relief soothed his parched mouth, memories of his ordeal came flooding back. The bear, the chase, the desperate fight for survival. It all seemed like a nightmare, but the pain in his body confirmed its reality. What happened?" Ethan managed to croak out. Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending physician, stepped forward. "Mr. Rodriguez, you've been through quite an ordeal. You were rescued 4 days ago from Banff National Park. You've suffered hypothermia, multiple lacerations, and a concussion, among other injuries. But you're stable now, and with time and proper care, you should make a full recovery." Ethan nodded slowly, wincing at the movement. "The bear, tranquilized during your rescue," Dr. Chun explained. "It's been relocated deeper into the park, away from common hiking trails." As the days passed, Ethan's physical wounds began to heal, but the psychological scars ran deep. Nightmares plagued his sleep, filled with growls and the sensation of being hunted. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. During one of these episodes, a kind-faced nurse named John found Ethan huddled in the corner of his room. "Shaitan." "It's okay, Ethan," John said softly, approaching slowly. "You're safe now. You're in the hospital. Remember?" Ethan looked up, his eyes wild with fear. "I can still hear it. The bear. It's coming for me." John sat down next to him, not touching but close enough to offer comfort. "That must have been terrifying, but you survived, Ethan. You're stronger than you know." As Ethan's physical condition improved, he was visited by Ranger Sarah Thompson, who had been part of his rescue team. She carried a folder with her, her face serious. "Ethan," she began, "I know this might be difficult, but we need to go over what happened. It's important for our official report, and it might help prevent similar incidents in the future." Ethan nodded, steeling himself. Over the next hour, he recounted his harrowing experience, his voice sometimes faltering as he relived the terror. Ranger Thompson listened attentively, taking notes. When Ethan finished, she looked at him with a mix of admiration and concern. "You showed incredible resilience out there, Easton, but I have to ask, why did you continue your trip despite our warnings about increased bear activity?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, shame coloring his face. "I saw it. I thought I could handle it. I've been hiking and camping for years. I guess I underestimated the danger." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "It's a mistake many experienced outdoorsmen make. Nature deserves our respect, always." As she was leaving, Sarah paused at the door. "Ethan, have you considered speaking with a counselor? What you went through, it can leave scars that aren't visible." Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. Maybe that would be a good idea." In the following weeks, as Ethan's physical recovery progressed, he began sessions with Dr. Lisa Patel, a trauma specialist. Their first meeting was tense, with Ethan reluctant to open up. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, fidgeting in his chair. "I survived. Isn't that enough?" Dr. Patel smiled gently. "Survival is incredible, Ethan. But now comes the part where we help you truly live again, not just survive." Over time, Ethan began to open up about his fears, his nightmares, and the guilt he felt for putting himself and his rescuers in danger. "I keep thinking," he said during one session, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if I had died out there? What would that have done to my mom, my friends? All because I was too stubborn to listen to warnings." Dr. Patel leaned forward. "Ethan, it's natural to have these thoughts. But remember, you can't change the past. What you can do is learn from it, grow from it." As Ethan's discharge date approached, he faced a new challenge: the prospect of returning home, of facing the world outside the safety of the hospital. The night before he was set to leave, Ethan stood at the window of his hospital room, looking out at the city lights. His mother found him there, lost in thought. "Majito," she said softly, "what's troubling you?" Ethan turned to her, his eyes reflecting his inner turmoil. "Mom, I don't know if I can do it. Go back out there, I mean,